I'm Nathaniel Brooks, 41 years old, senior operations manager in Charlotte, North Carolina, a man who built his career on noticing patterns before they turned into problems. And that night, I noticed everything. The townhouse in Dilworth had been our joint project. Exposed brick restored by hand. Custom shelving I installed myself. The walnut dining table sanded and sealed over 3 sleepless weeks during lockdown when the world felt uncertain, but my marriage still felt solid. Melissa loved telling people how told a story, but most of that story was written in my callous hands in late nights after conference calls. The dinner had been her idea, framed as something casual and warm, a chance to reconnect with her college friend Jason Keller, who had recently rebranded himself after what she called a complicated breakup, the kind of phrasing she used when she wanted to make chaos sound sophisticated. I grilled the ribeyes to a precise medium rare, resting them properly before slicing, letting the juices settle the way discipline had always steadied my life. I uncorked the $120 Cabernet we had been saving for an anniversary that never quite seemed to come at the right moment, and I watched the dark red swirl against crystal as I poured 3 even glasses. When Jason walked in, he did not offer a handshake, did not even meet my eyes with the basic courtesy most men extend when stepping into another man's home. He moved past me as if I were part of the architecture, scanning the living room with slow appraisal, commenting on the open layout, the lighting, the artwork, his voice carrying the self-satisfied tone of someone who believes observation equals ownership. He reached for the dimmer switch without asking, lowering the lights as though he were setting the stage for something he had already rehearsed in his mind. Melissa shifted almost immediately. I have known her for over a decade, long enough to distinguish between her private laugh and the polished version she deploys at networking events around Jason. Her tone lifted half an octave, airy and performative, the cadence of someone aware of being watched. She leaned in when he spoke, brushed her hair back more often than necessary, let her hand rest on his forearm for a fraction of a second longer than coincidence allows. He stood close, too close, his body angled toward hers in a way that excluded me physically before either of them had excluded me verbally. I said nothing. I have learned that silence can be more revealing than confrontation, and I wanted to see how far performance would go when it believed it had an audience that was too polite to interrupt. At the table I built with my own hands, Jason dominated the conversation, narrating his reinvention with the confidence of a man who mistakes volume for depth. He described his breakup as if it were a branding exercise, how he had taken time to refocus, optimize, realign his values, the language of a corporate pitch applied to personal failure. Melissa absorbed every word, nodding, laughing, occasionally glancing at me with brightness that felt rehearsed rather than shared. I cut my steak methodically, tasting smoke and salt and a faint metallic edge of something sour that had nothing to do with the wine. Every gesture between them registered in my mind like data points, small but accumulating, and I felt the quiet tightening in my chest that comes not from jealousy, but from recognition I did not confront it. I did not raise my voice or challenge his familiarity. I observed the way he referred to our home as a great space for entertaining, the way he spoke about future dinners as if he assumed an invitation. I observed the way Melissa corrected me mid-sentence when I described a project at work, only to let Jason ramble uninterrupted about sales metrics and personal growth seminars. I observed how she looked at him when she thought I was focused on the grill, how he looked at her when he thought I was focused on the wine. I have spent years managing operations by identifying inefficiencies before they collapse a system, and that night I understood with clarity that unsettled me that something in my marriage had shifted long before Jason crossed my threshold, and dinner was not the beginning of the problem, but the first time I allowed myself to see it without looking away. Dinner began civil on the surface, the kind of polite choreography adults perform when they are testing boundaries without admitting it, and Jason slipped into the rhythm as if he had practiced for this exact stage, leaning back in his chair with casual authority, while detailing the $2.3 million contract he had just closed, emphasizing the number twice as though the value alone conferred superiority, describing his twice-monthly flights to Miami and the so-called real pressure that builds character in men who are willing to risk everything for growth. He spoke in sweeping statements about dominance in negotiations, about reading rooms and controlling outcomes, about how leadership was not about systems but about presence. And every time he glanced at me, there was a thin, deliberate curve to his mouth that suggested he was measuring himself against me and already declaring victory in a contest I had never agreed to enter. When I mentioned a logistics crisis I had resolved at work, a multi-state supply chain breakdown that threatened millions in losses until I coordinated rerouting, negotiated temporary warehousing, and stabilized operations within 72 hours, he smirked openly and joked that spreadsheet guys rarely understand real leadership because they hide behind numbers instead of people. The comment landed exactly as intended, dressed as humor but sharpened with contempt. And before I could even decide whether to respond, Melissa laughed, not with the restrained courtesy of a wife acknowledging awkward banter, but with a bright, enthusiastic burst that filled the dining room and lingered in the air longer than the joke deserved. I felt the subtle shift in gravity at the table, as if the axis of the room had tilted slightly away from me and toward him, and I noted it without reacting, because I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching me flinch. The jabs continued in smaller, more calculated doses, comments about my predictable lifestyle, about how operations managers thrive on routine because chaos scares them, about how ambition requires risk and boldness rather than stability and planning. He asked, in a tone too polished to be innocent, whether Melissa and I scheduled intimacy on a shared calendar the way I schedule quarterly reviews, and he chuckled at his own wit as though he had delivered something profound instead of cheap. Melissa covered her smile with her wine glass, but did not correct him, did not defend me, did not signal that the line had been crossed, and that silence from her was louder than any insult he could have crafted. I stayed calm, cutting my steak into even portions, chewing deliberately, refusing to feed the performance he was orchestrating. I have spent 2 decades in corporate environments where men posture and test one another, and I know that attention is oxygen for that kind of behavior. So I denied him the reaction he wanted. I responded to direct questions with measured clarity, neither apologizing for my career nor boasting about it, and I let his exaggerations hang in the air without endorsement. Yet the atmosphere tightened, because there is a point where restraint stops being diplomacy and begins to look like permission. Then Jason leaned back fully in his chair, one arm draped over back, as if he were in his own dining room, swirling the Cabernet I had purchased with a casual entitlement that grated against my composure, and he said, in a tone smooth enough to disguise the insult, that Melissa deserved a man with ambition, someone bold enough to take risks, someone who understood how to command a room. The statement did not need to include my name to make its target clear. The room went still in a way that only happens when something irreparable has just been said, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly louder, the faint clink of glass against it echoing unnaturally. I placed my fork down with deliberate control, aligned it parallel to the knife, lifted my gaze directly to him, and said evenly, "You're a guest in my home. Show respect." My voice did not rise, did not tremble, did not betray the pulse beating hard in my throat. It was not a threat, not a plea, simply a boundary articulated in plain language. Melissa reacted before he did. She turned toward me sharply, her expression flashing with irritation rather than concern, accusing me of overreacting, of making things awkward, of embarrassing her in front of her friend. She defended him, insisted he was joking, insisted I was being sensitive, and in that instant I understood something far more unsettling than any insult Jason could deliver. She did not stand beside me. She stood across from me. That was the first crack I could not ignore, because it was not about a comment or a joke or a bottle of wine. It was about alignment. It was about where loyalty instinctively falls when pressure is applied. And for the first time in our marriage, I saw clearly that the foundation I believed was solid might have been resting on something far more fragile than I had ever allowed myself to consider. After Jason left without shaking my hand, without even offering the thin courtesy of eye contact at the door, the house felt different, as though the air itself had shifted in density, and Melissa followed me into the kitchen with a tension that was not embarrassment but indignation. She did not ease into conversation or attempt diplomacy. She confronted me immediately, demanding that I apologize to him for creating tension, as if the discomfort in the room had originated from my boundary rather than his provocation. I let out a short, controlled laugh, not loud enough to be theatrical, not bitter enough to be cruel, just a brief release of disbelief at the inversion of reality I was witnessing. The absurdity of being asked to apologize to a man who had insulted me in my own home was so stark that almost felt scripted. She escalated quickly, her posture tightening, her words sharpening into ultimatums delivered with unsettling calm. She framed it as a matter of maturity versus insecurity, suggesting that confident men do not react to harmless jokes, and that my response revealed something small in me. The narrative she constructed was efficient and strategic, recasting disrespect as humor, and my refusal to tolerate it as emotional fragility. She said, "Apologize or we're done," not in a shout, but in a steady tone that implied she believed she held leverage. I did not raise my voice, did not match her intensity, did not offer dramatic counteraccusations. I answered in single sentences, measured and deliberate, because I have learned that clarity requires fewer words than defensiveness. I said I would not apologize for asking for respect. I said I would not participate in rewriting what had happened. I said if she believed I was a problem, she was free to act accordingly. The silence that followed was colder than any argument. She stared at me as if waiting for a crack, waiting for me to retreat and smooth things over the way couples often do when pride cools. But I did not retreat. Something fundamental had shifted, and I understood that once a line is drawn clearly, stepping back over for comfort is a form of self-betrayal. She turned away first, her movements controlled but pointed, and announced she would not sleep in our bedroom that night. The statement was delivered as punishment, as a withdrawal of intimacy meant to trigger urgency in me. But I did not chase her into the hallway or attempt to negotiate. Instead, the house became a stage for her controlled demonstrations of displeasure. Drawers closed a fraction louder than necessary. Cabinet doors met their frames with just enough force to register, but not enough to justify complaint. Footsteps echoed through the hallway in deliberate rhythm. Each sound was calibrated to communicate injury, while preserving plausible innocence, a choreography of martyrdom designed to provoke reaction. I remained in the bedroom, sitting at the edge of the bed I had built, absorbing the noise without engaging it. I did not text, did not call, did not rehearse arguments in my head. I lay down eventually and stared at the ceiling, not in despair, but in recalibration. The next morning, I moved through the house with the same steady precision I use when adjusting operational risk at work. I removed the spare house key from its discreet hook near the entryway and placed it inside my safe, closing the metal door with a soft click that felt heavier than the sound suggested. I took my passport from the drawer in the study and slid it into my work briefcase, not because I had travel planned, but because access is leverage and leverage should not be left unattended. On my way to the office, I stopped at a bank branch I had never used before and opened a new checking account in my name only, transferring a measured amount from my personal funds into it without disrupting visible routines. I did not announce any of it. I did not threaten, did not accuse, did not dramatize. I simply adjusted. The way I have always adjusted when the data indicates a system is no longer as stable as it appears. Over the next week, the house operated under a thin layer of artificial normalcy. Conversations reduced to logistics and tone stripped of warmth. It was during one of those quiet evenings that I picked up our shared tablet from the kitchen counter to check a calendar entry and noticed a messaging notification still open in the corner of the screen. I do not make a habit of searching for betrayal, but I also do not ignore information placed directly in front of me, and what I saw required no interpretation. It was a group chat between Melissa and two of her closest friends, the kind of ongoing commentary thread people maintain to curate their private narratives, and I read in clear language how I've been recast as controlling, fragile, threatened by confident men, incapable of handling playful banter. The words were casual but precise, emojis softening the cruelty, laughter embedded in screenshots of my message about respect, as if boundaries were punchlines rather than principles. There was no outrage in me when I read it, only confirmation. I took screenshots of the thread exactly as it appeared, preserving timestamps and context, and sent them to myself before closing the application without altering a single message. Later that same evening, my phone lit up with a direct text from Jason, a message crafted with polished condescension, suggesting that an apology from me would smooth everything over and allow everyone to move forward like adults. The phrasing was deliberate, positioning himself as a reasonable party and me as the obstacle to harmony. I did not respond. I archived the message, created a digital folder labeled with that day's date, and placed the screenshots and his text inside it. Organization is not paranoia. It is preparation. Melissa shifted tactics midweek and proposed a double date to clear the air, framing it as an opportunity for growth and maturity, as though reconciliation required performance in front of an audience. I declined without elaboration, stating simply that I was not interested in socializing under those conditions. She accused me of punishing her with silence, of weaponizing restraint to make her uncomfortable, and I listened without interruption, because accusation often reveals more than defense. When she finished, I asked one clean question, delivered without emphasis or theatrics, asking who mattered more, her husband or him. The simplicity of it seemed to disorient her, because it removed abstraction and forced a binary she preferred to blur. She immediately labeled the question manipulative, an attempt to control her friendships, and pivoted back to the narrative of insecurity. She repeated her ultimatum with sharper edges this time, saying that if I did not apologize by the last day of the month, she would consider the marriage unsalvageable. The deadline was spoken as though it were leverage, as though pressure would produce compliance. I walked to the desk and study, opened a leather-bound notebook where I tracked projects and commitments, and wrote the date down in clear block letters. I closed the notebook, returned to the kitchen, and said noted that single word unsettled her more than anger would have. There was no pleading in it, no attempt to negotiate, no visible panic, only acknowledgement. She expected resistance, perhaps even a raised voice, she could point to as evidence of volatility, but instead she received documentation. Her irritation surfaced immediately, a tightness around her mouth, a comment about how cold I become, how transactional I sounded. I did not defend the tone. I did not soften it. In my world, when someone sets a deadline, you mark it and prepare accordingly. Over the following days, I continued to function normally, leaving for work at the same hour, returning with groceries when needed, maintaining the routines that make a household run smoothly. Internally, however, I was no longer operating from assumption but from assessment, and once that shift occurs, it does not reverse easily. Small sabotage is followed with a kind of deniability that only works when the target doubts his own perception, but I do not doubt patterns once they repeat. My car keys, which had lived for years in the same ceramic bowl by the entryway, began appearing in odd places, once inside a kitchen drawer beneath dish towels, another time tucked into the pocket of a coat I had not worn in months. My gym bag, which I had packed the night before an early training session, was left on the patio during a storm, soaked through by morning rain. The leather straps warped and the contents damp enough to require replacement. A calendar appointment appeared on our shared digital planner labeled as mandatory, scheduled precisely during an executive meeting I had been preparing for all quarter, a false entry designed to create confusion and conflict if I had not double-checked my professional calendar independently. Each incident, standing alone, could have been explained away as oversight or coincidence, but together they formed a sequence too deliberate to ignore. I documented everything. I photographed misplaced items exactly where I found them before returning them to their proper place. I saved calendar history showing creation timestamps. I wrote dates and brief descriptions in the same leather notebook where I had marked her ultimatum. I did not confront her about each action because confrontation would have transformed documentation into debate, and I was no longer interested in arguing about reality. Quietly, I separated finances with the same precision I applied to operational restructuring at work. I rerouted my $9,800 monthly paycheck into the new checking account I had opened, ensuring direct deposit information was updated before the next payroll cycle. I removed her as an authorized user for my credit cards, an administrative process that required nothing more than a secure login and a confirmation code. I froze our joint line of credit to prevent unilateral withdrawals, an action that triggered notification but not conversation. Essential obligations remained funded without interruption. The mortgage payment process on schedule, utilities, insurance, property taxes, and share necessities continued as they always had. Stability and infrastructure is a choice. Boutique shopping transactions, discretionary subscriptions, and brunch reservations at curated restaurants did not process because the accounts previously used for those expenses were no longer accessible. The distinction was intentional. I was not destabilizing our household. I was narrowing it to its functional core. I consulted a divorce attorney recommended discreetly by a colleague whose judgment I trust. The consultation was clinical and efficient, conducted in a downtown office where confidentiality is assumed rather than requested. I paid a $5,000 retainer without hesitation and handed over every screenshot, every documented incident, every archived message organized by date. The attorney reviewed the material with the detached focus of someone accustomed to emotional volatility and said little beyond outlining next steps. Within days, a formal notice of representation was sent on my behalf, language precise, tone restrained, signaling that communication would proceed through counsel. Melissa's response moved through predictable stages. First came tears, sudden and theatrical, accusations that I was destroying our life over pride, that I had escalated a simple misunderstanding into catastrophe. When tears failed to shift my position, rage surfaced, sharp words about betrayal, about financial control, about how cold and calculated I had become. When anger met the same calm response, she attempted seduction, appearing in the doorway of my office late, one evening dressed in familiarity, voice softened, suggesting reconnection as though physical proximity could erase documented reality. Each time, regardless of tone or tactic, I answered the same way, steady and unembellished, instructing her to coordinate with counsel. The repetition unsettled her more than any argument would have, because it removed the arena in which she was accustomed to operating. There were no raised voices to capture, no emotional outbursts to weaponize, no improvisation to exploit. Only process, only structure, only the quiet certainty of a man who has assessed the system and decided it cannot be repaired through conversation alone. Jason attempted one final performance on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of overcast day that flattens everything into dull contrast, by pulling his late model SUV into my driveway without notice and stepping out as though he had been invited. I watched the notification from my security camera appear on my phone while I was finishing a call in my home office. His figure captured clearly by the wide-angle lens mounted above the garage, pacing once before straightening his jacket and walking toward the front door. He rang the bell with theatrical patience, hands clasped in front of him, then knocked as if to amplify the drama of his presence. I did not rush. I adjusted the camera feed to full screen and began recording from my phone before unlocking the door. When I opened it, he smiled in that curated way he reserves for boardrooms and networking events, announcing that he wanted to talk man to man, as though the phrase itself conferred authority. He stepped onto the porch, posture wide, shoulders squared, attempting to reestablish the dominance he believed he had displayed at my dining table. I did not invite him inside. Instead, I lifted my hand calmly and pointed to the small black lens mounted above the doorway, then held up my phone so he could see his reflection on the screen and understand that every word, every gesture, every inflection was being captured. The shift was immediate and almost clinical. His tone recalibrated within seconds, volume lowering, cadence smoothing, the bravado dissolving into cautious politeness. He spoke about misunderstandings and tension and how things had gotten out of hand, framing himself as a mediator rather than an instigator. I responded in short, neutral sentences, reminding him that any further communication should go through counsel and that appearing uninvited at my home was neither appropriate nor constructive. He nodded too quickly, glancing once at the camera again as if recalculating risk, and within minutes he retreated down the walkway with far less swagger than he had carried up it. The recording was archived in the same dated folder structure I had maintained from the beginning, labeled clearly and backed up to secure drive my attorney, followed with formal preservation letter addressed to Jason, demanding that all communications, messages, emails, and social media exchanges related to me be retained without deletion or alteration. The language was precise and unambiguous, outlining the legal obligation to preserve potential evidence in anticipation of litigation. The effect was measurable. His subsequent messages, routed through legal channels, were stripped of sarcasm and performance, replaced by careful phrasing and deferential tone. Swagger rarely survives documentation. Meanwhile, Melissa pivoted her narrative toward financial abuse, claiming in mediation that I was controlling her access to money as a tactic of punishment. The accusation was delivered with practiced emotion, her voice steady but wounded, an attempt to reposition herself as the injured party. The mediator, a seasoned professional who had seen every variation of strategic framing, reviewed the financial statements and separation timeline, without visible reaction, before calmly correcting her, explaining that reallocating income into individual accounts while maintaining essential household expenses is standard separation protocol and does not constitute abuse. The clarity of that statement landed heavier than any argument I could have made myself. As legal structure replaced social performance, her circle began to thin. Friends who once engaged enthusiastically in group chats about my supposed fragility grew quieter when preservation letters and documented evidence entered the conversation. Invitations slowed. The tone of outside support shifted from confident commentary to cautious distance. Gossip thrives in ambiguity but retracts when consequences attach themselves to words. Through it all, I maintained the same response to every attempt at direct engagement, whether from Melissa or Jason, directing them back to counsel, refusing improvisation, refusing spectacle. In the absence of chaos, the truth no longer needed volume. Mediation sessions in early April unfolded with a sterile precision that stripped away performance and reduced everything to numbers, timelines, and documented conduct, and I found the atmosphere almost calming compared to the emotional volatility of the previous month. Melissa arrived each time composed and impeccably dressed, her posture communicating resilience, but the room itself did not respond to posture or tone, only the facts entered into record. Her attorney opened with a request for temporary spousal support in the amount of $4,000 per month, framing it as necessary to maintain her accustomed lifestyle during transition, and the figure was delivered as if repetition alone could justify it. I slid forward the detailed budget my attorney and I had prepared, a clean spreadsheet reflecting actual expenses, liabilities, and income allocations, supported by statements and payment histories that showed continuity of mortgage, utilities, insurance, and shared obligations throughout the separation. There was no theatrical rebuttal, only arithmetic. The mediator reviewed the documents, compared projected needs against demonstrated resources, and declined the request without embellishment, noting that there was no financial basis for temporary support given to maintain household funding and her independent earning capacity as a consultant. The denial shifted the energy in the room subtly but decisively, because it marked the first time her expectations met a boundary enforced by someone other than me. Later in the process, the mediator asked directly whether reconciliation was possible, not as a sentimental inquiry, but as a procedural requirement to determine whether further sessions would focus on repair or dissolution. I answered without hesitation and without hostility, stating that I would not reconcile with an ultimatum tied to another man's ego. The sentence was not dramatic, yet it cut through the discussion with finality because it reframed the conflict in its simplest terms. There was no counterargument offered, no attempt to reinterpret that statement. And in that moment the debate ended not with raised voices, but with acknowledgement. From there, the negotiations narrowed to division rather than persuasion. We agreed to list the townhouse, the property I had renovated board by board, and to split the equity evenly once sold. The numbers were calculated, adjusted for closing costs and outstanding balances, and accepted without prolonged dispute. Our savings were divided in accordance with documented contributions and state guidelines, neither side extracting advantage beyond what the law permitted. We waived alimony entirely, a decision recorded formally and initial without ceremony. She retained her SUV, a vehicle she favored for its image as much as its function, and I kept my pickup along with my retirement accounts intact, accounts built over years of consistent contributions and disciplined planning. Within 6 weeks of that dinner, provisional agreements were drafted, reviewed, revised minimally, and signed. The process that had been framed as a month designed to pressure me into submission instead became the timeline by which I exited cleanly. There were no grand declarations, no last-minute pleas, only signatures on paper and the quiet recognition that structure, once established, does not yield to theatrics. By July, the townhouse closed at $640,000, the number appearing on the final settlement statement in clean black ink, stripped of sentiment, stripped of memory, reduced to equity and distribution. I walked through the empty rooms one last time before handing over the keys. The walnut table already moved. The walls bare where framed photographs had once hung, and I felt no surge in nostalgia, only acknowledgement that a structure can be beautiful and still no longer be yours. The transfer funds hit my account within 48 hours. The split executed exactly as outlined. No last-minute objections. No dramatic reversals. Precision from start to finish. I moved into a top-floor condo overlooking Freedom Park, drawn less by status and more by vantage point, by the quiet line of trees and the early morning runners tracing predictable paths around the water. The space was smaller but intentional. Open light, clean lines, nothing excessive. I installed a compact home gym against the far wall of the second bedroom. Squat rack anchored securely, plates organized, bench aligned parallel to window, so I could watch the sunrise while pressing weight upward. Routine returned in measured increments. I resumed therapy every Tuesday at 7 in the morning, arriving early, sitting in the waiting room without distraction, speaking plainly about ego, boundaries, and the cost of silence when silence is misinterpreted as weakness. Healing, I learned, is not dramatic. It is procedural. Melissa sent one final message late in the month, a single paragraph saying she had reflected on that night, on how things escalated, on how neither of us handled it perfectly. The phrasing was careful, balanced enough to imply accountability, without conceding too much. I read it once, waited an hour, and replied with her words, "I wish you well." There was nothing else to say that would improve either of our futures. Jason disappeared from the narrative entirely. No further appearances, no additional messages, his presence evaporating once the arena no longer offered spectacle. Some men require audience to exist. A quiet that followed was not victory. There were no champagne toasts, no triumphant declarations, no sense of conquest. It was clarity, a stillness that arrives when noise finally exhausts itself. I learned that respect is not negotiated under threat, and that an ultimatum framed as growth is rarely about growth at all. When someone says apologize or we're done, they are not inviting dialogue. They are testing leverage, measuring whether fear will override principle. I chose stillness instead of spectacle, documentation instead of argument, consequence instead of reaction. I did not chase validation, did not seek revenge, did not attempt to rewrite the narrative in my favor. I simply held the line. In the months since, my name remains intact, unassociated with scandal or spectacle. My finances structured and transparent. My account secure, my obligations met. I wake before sunrise most days, step on the balcony with coffee in hand, and feel the absence of chaos more than any presence of triumph. Peace is not loud. It does not need witnesses. It is a steady knowledge that when tested, I did not barter my dignity for temporary harmony. When the dust settled and the conversations faded, I was the only one still standing exactly where I chose to stand, in control of my name, my finances, and my peace.